Venezuela, a nation blessed with abundant natural resources, has long been trapped in a cycle of political turmoil and economic hardship. The disputed presidential election of July 28, 2024, plunged the country deeper into crisis, exacerbating existing tensions and igniting widespread unrest. Incumbent President Nicolas Maduro claimed victory, but his assertion was met with skepticism and outright rejection from international observers and a significant portion of the Venezuelan population. Opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, widely seen as representing a viable alternative to Maduro's rule, appeared poised for a landslide victory. With 81% of the votes tallied, Gonzalez held a commanding lead, fueling hope for a democratic transition. However, the sudden halt in vote counting and the subsequent declaration of Maduro as the victor sent shockwaves through the nation. The international community, already wary of Maduro's tightening grip on power, swiftly condemned the election as fraudulent. The United Nations, the Carter Center, and numerous democratic governments denounced the lack of transparency and the suppression of opposition voices. Their calls for a recount and for respect for the will of the Venezuelan people went unheeded. Venezuela teetered on the brink, bracing for the inevitable fallout from a deeply flawed election. The stage was set for a showdown between a government determined to cling to power at all costs and a populace yearning for change and a brighter future. The disputed election unleashed a wave of protests across Venezuela as citizens took to the streets to express their outrage and demand a return to democratic order. But their cries for freedom were met with the full force of a government determined to crush dissent. Security forces, backed by pro-government paramilitary groups known as colectivos, cracked down on demonstrators with brutal efficiency. The streets of Caracas and other major cities transformed into battlegrounds, as tear gas choked the air and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the night. Human Rights Watch documented the killings of at least 24 protesters in the immediate aftermath of the election, with evidence implicating security forces and colectivos in the violence. Thousands were swept up in mass arrests, often on trumped-up charges of incitement, resistance, and even terrorism. The Venezuelan government, long accused of silencing its critics, employed these vague and overly broad charges to justify the detention of anyone deemed a threat to its authority. The legal system, once a symbol of justice, became a tool of repression. Beyond the arrests and violence, the Maduro regime implemented a series of insidious measures designed to stifle dissent and maintain its stranglehold on power. Critics of the government, including journalists, activists, and opposition leaders, found themselves stripped of their passports, effectively trapping them within Venezuela's borders. The political and social upheaval engulfing Venezuela has exacted a devastating toll on the nation's most vulnerable citizens, its children. Trapped in a maelstrom of violence, poverty, and fear, Venezuelan children have borne the brunt of the crisis, their innocence shattered, their futures uncertain. Amnesty International has meticulously documented the plight of children caught in the crossfire, revealing a pattern of systematic abuse and human rights violations. In the tumultuous days following the disputed election, at least 6 children were arbitrarily detained and subjected to torture by security forces. Their only crime, daring to raise their voices in protest against a government that had failed them. As of November 2024, Amnesty International estimated that at least 198 children remained unjustly imprisoned in Venezuela, languishing in overcrowded and unsanitary detention centers. Many faced fabricated charges, denied due process and access to legal counsel. Others endured physical and psychological abuse at the hands of their jailers, their cries for help ignored. The crisis has inflicted deep psychological wounds on a generation of Venezuelan children. The constant threat of violence, the loss of loved ones, and the disintegration of their communities have left an enduring scar on their collective psyche. Mental health experts have warned of a surge in cases of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and even suicide among Venezuelan children, a tragic testament to the human cost of a nation in crisis. The international community watched in horror as the situation in Venezuela spiraled downward, the democratic aspirations of its people crushed under the weight of authoritarianism and repression. Condemnations poured in from governments and international organizations alike, demanding an end to the violence and a return to democratic principles. The Organization of American States, a regional body committed to upholding democracy and human rights in the Americas, issued a scathing rebuke of the Maduro regime. The OAS demanded the immediate publication of detailed vote tallies from the disputed election, calling for an impartial verification process to ensure the integrity of the results. The European Union, the United States, and numerous other democratic nations echoed these calls, urging Maduro to respect the results of a free and fair election, to guarantee the fundamental rights of his opponents, and to cease the brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters. They imposed targeted sanctions on members of the Maduro government and their allies, seeking to pressure the regime to change course. The International Criminal Court, tasked with investigating and prosecuting individuals accused of the gravest crimes under international law, turned its attention to Venezuela. The ICC's chief prosecutor announced an active investigation into allegations of crimes against humanity committed by Venezuelan authorities, signaling that those responsible for the violence and repression would be held accountable. The political and economic turmoil engulfing Venezuela has fueled a mass exodus of its citizens, creating one of the largest displacement crises in recent history. Millions have fled their homeland, desperate to escape the violence, poverty, and hopelessness that have gripped their nation. As of June 2024, over 7.7 million Venezuelans had sought refuge beyond their country's borders, their lives upended, their dreams shattered. The vast majority, some 6.1 million, found themselves scattered across Latin America and the Caribbean, seeking safety and a chance to rebuild their lives. Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor to the west, has borne the brunt of this exodus, with over 2.9 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees seeking refuge within its borders. This massive influx has strained Colombia's resources and social services, testing the limits of its generosity and its capacity to absorb those fleeing hardship. The Venezuelan diaspora, once a trickle, has become a torrent, carrying with it stories of loss, resilience, and an unwavering hope for a brighter future. Families have been torn apart, their lives scattered across continents. Professionals have been forced to abandon their careers, their skills and talents wasted. And children have been robbed of their childhoods, their education disrupted, their futures uncertain. The political and economic crisis gripping Venezuela has had a devastating impact on the country's food system, leaving millions struggling to feed themselves and their families. The once prosperous nation, blessed with fertile land and abundant natural resources, now faces widespread hunger and malnutrition. Hyperinflation, economic mismanagement, and government policies that have crippled domestic food production have created a perfect storm, leaving grocery store shelves bare and driving prices of basic necessities beyond the reach of ordinary Venezuelans. The World Food Program estimates that the number of people facing acute food insecurity in Venezuela is expected to surge to 3.5 million by July 2024, up from 2 million in January of the same year. The most vulnerable segments of Venezuelan society, including children, pregnant women, and the elderly, are bearing the brunt of this crisis. Malnutrition rates have soared, stunting the growth and development of a generation of Venezuelan children. Hospitals are overwhelmed with cases of severe malnutrition, their limited resources stretched thin. The crisis has forced many Venezuelans to resort to desperate measures to survive. Families are skipping meals, reducing portion sizes, and selling off their possessions just to afford basic foodstuffs. Others have turned to scavenging for scraps in garbage dumps, their dignity stripped away by the relentless pangs of hunger. The humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has placed children at heightened risk of exploitation, abuse, and trafficking, as families struggle to meet their basic needs, and children are forced to navigate a perilous landscape devoid of protection. The breakdown of social structures, coupled with widespread poverty and displacement, has created fertile ground for predators seeking to exploit the vulnerable. With limited access to education, healthcare, and safe spaces, Venezuelan children are increasingly vulnerable to child labor, sexual exploitation, and recruitment into armed groups. Many are forced to drop out of school to help their families make ends meet, their dreams of a brighter future put on hold. The dangerous journey undertaken by many Venezuelan migrants and refugees, often across treacherous terrain and through lawless border regions, exposes children to a myriad of risks. Separated from their families, they become easy prey for traffickers who lure them with false promises of food, shelter, and a better life. The Darien Gap, a treacherous stretch of jungle separating Colombia and Panama, has become a symbol of the perils facing Venezuelan migrants and refugees, particularly children. World Vision reports a 40% increase in the number of children attempting to cross the Darien Gap in 2024, with over 30,000 making the perilous journey in the first 4 months of the year alone. Amidst the despair and suffering, glimmers of hope emerge as the international community rallies to provide humanitarian assistance and support to the Venezuelan people. International organizations, neighboring countries, and individuals of conscience have stepped up to provide food, shelter, medical care, and other essential services to those in need. Neighboring countries, already grappling with the influx of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, have shown remarkable compassion and generosity, opening their borders and providing access to basic services. Colombia, in particular, has implemented policies to regularize the status of Venezuelan migrants, granting them temporary legal status and access to work permits. International organizations, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Programme, and UNICEF, are working tirelessly to provide humanitarian assistance to those affected by the crisis, both within Venezuela and in neighboring countries. They are providing food, clean water, shelter, healthcare, and psychosocial support to millions in need. However, the scale of the crisis is immense, and the needs far outstrip the available resources. The humanitarian response remains chronically underfunded, hampering efforts to provide timely and effective assistance to those most in need. Political obstacles and the Venezuelan government's reluctance to fully cooperate with international organizations further complicate aid delivery. Venezuela stands at a crossroads, its future uncertain, its people yearning for a return to peace, prosperity, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The road ahead will be long and arduous, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But amidst the darkness, the resilience of the Venezuelan people, their unwavering belief in a better future, offers a flicker of hope. A lasting solution to Venezuela's multifaceted crisis will require a multi-pronged approach, addressing the root causes of the political, economic, and social turmoil that has gripped the nation. A return to democratic governance, respect for human rights, and the rule of law are essential prerequisites for progress. Rebuilding Venezuela's shattered economy, once the envy of Latin America, will require sound economic policies, tackling hyperinflation, attracting foreign investment, and fostering sustainable development. Addressing the humanitarian crisis, providing for the basic needs of the Venezuelan people, and ensuring their access to essential services must be immediate priorities. The international community has a moral obligation to stand with the Venezuelan people in their hour of need, providing humanitarian assistance, supporting efforts to promote dialogue and reconciliation, and holding those responsible for human rights violations accountable for their actions.